but we're going to start now by looking at other trends and headlines from the new civil and political rights data. So I'd like to introduce our methodology research and design lead, Dr. Kay Chad Clay from the University of Georgia in the United States. But you're not in the US right now, are you, Chad?
Yeah, that's right, Taya. Currently at the National University of Ireland in Galway, leading a University of Georgia study away program where we're aiming to teach students about human rights in the European Union and dissent and repression in the context of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And those students are actually in the audience today. So we're all very, very pleased to have the opportunity to participate in this conversation and to introduce the world to HRMI's latest data release.
That's great. It's always great to have your students with us. Welcome. Now, Chad, you have eaten, drunk, slept, and breathed these data over the last couple of months. What interesting trends and patterns and headlines have you spotted that you'd like to talk about?
So, as is the case in most years, there's more stories in the data than we could possibly ever cover. But a few things do stand out to me. I'll start with some positive news. It would appear that the global decline in civil and political rights that we observed in the wake of the COVID pandemic in 2020, which was detailed, we wrote a special report just last year about this that we released around this time. You can find on the website. But it seems that decline due to COVID may have stalled in 2021, which is good news. I don't want to overstate the good news. It doesn't really appear that we regained all of the losses we suffered in 2020, but the decreases in respect for civil and political rights in 2021 were just much, much rarer than the improvements that we observed in our data, which is a very, very welcome change from last year. That said, there are a few exceptions, sadly. First, after reducing its use of the death penalty during the pandemic in 2020, Saudi Arabia returned to its pre-pandemic levels of the use of the death penalty, which are among the highest observed in our data set. Second, there's 3 countries that experienced pretty significant decreases in the right to assembly and association in 2021. Samoa is one of them. I suspect largely related to events around the highly contested elections that occurred there in 2021. The United Kingdom, with restrictions related once again to attempts to prevent the spread of COVID-19. And then, as some of our panelists mentioned, Hong Kong, which continued a very, very dramatic slide in its respect for empowerment rights that we observed last year as well. And many of our respondents have connected those declines to the passage of the national security law in Hong Kong.
So speaking of Hong Kong, our panel just raised, many interesting points about the China data. Since this is the first year we've had China in the civil and political rights data set, what stands out to you now that we have China's data alongside that of Hong Kong and Taiwan?
Yeah, the most obvious finding is probably also, as our panelists suggested, one of the most obvious is one of the least surprising, right? And that's that the Chinese government's civil and political rights practices are among the worst in our data set. And based on what we know about, the distribution of these kinds of practices around the world, probably around the worst in the world. Their scores rank very near the bottom of our data on safety from the state. And they're basically in a statistical tie for the absolute lowest scores on empowerment rights in the 2021 data. But similarly disheartening is the degree to which Hong Kong scores appear to be changing to converge with those that we observe in China. Since the passage of the national security law by the Beijing government in 2020, Hong Kong scores for the rights to assembly and association, the right to opinion and expression, and the right to political participation are all significantly lower than they were in 2019. And at this point, those scores are estimated only to be slightly higher than those for China. Hong Kong typically ranks in the bottom few countries in the world, or at least in our data set on each of those things. And I also find it interesting that there is a strong counterexample in the region in our data, and that's Taiwan. Which I think demonstrates that there's nothing about these poor practices that we're observing in China and Hong Kong that are predestined, right? Taiwan scores ranked near the top of most of our civil and political rights metrics, with scores that look a whole lot more like the really high-performing members of the Pacific region, who, once again, year after year, produce some of the highest scores we observe in our data, right there alongside South Korea and, as I said, Taiwan. Like any, I want to be clear though, like any country in our data set, Taiwan's not above critique. Unlike the vast majority of countries in our data set, Taiwan still maintains the death penalty and does still periodically execute people for committing capital offenses. Since I'm bringing up the death penalty, I suppose it makes sense to also talk about how on this, Taiwan still compares quite favorably with the Chinese government, which uses the death penalty to execute more people than any other country in our data set. And once again, according to a lot of external observers, probably executes more people than any country in the world. Further, there's some evidence that China, the Chinese government, right, like Saudi Arabia also in our data, blurs the line between extrajudicial killings and the death penalty, and potentially uses executions to eliminate those seen as political opponents to the state.
And with the death penalty, you're also working on some new data on that front?
Yeah, we are. So at HRMI, we think it's really, really important to measure freedom from the death penalty. The death penalty is banned in the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And many countries around the world have indeed banned its use. But somehow in many countries like my own, the United States, the death penalty is maintained, right? Now, in those countries that maintain the death penalty, once again, I'm referring from personal experience in the United States, talk about the death penalty is often, perhaps conveniently for those countries, excluded from the human rights conversation. And we think it's important that we bring that back in. And we think our current death penalty data are really useful for comparing countries on the number of people executed in any given year. But we're always looking for ways to improve our metrics. And so members of the CPR team, the Civil and Political Rights team, Meredith Lavelle and Matt Rains, who you'll all hear from in just a moment, as well as members of the Globus Human Rights Research Lab at the University of Georgia, have been working with me to complement our death penalty data with additional data on whether the death penalty is still legally retained in countries, the number of people who've been sentenced to death, the number of people currently awaiting execution, and other information. We're going to talk more about that in coming months, but we hope to have new data to release on this front before the end of the year, and we're really excited to continue developing them.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what you come up with. And for those in the audience who are working to abolish the death penalty, do follow us on social media or sign up for our occasional email newsletters to make sure that you hear about these new developments. Now, Chad, when we're talking about the death penalty, you mentioned your own country, the United States. You got a new president in 2021 and the legislature changed hands. Did that improve things?
Sadly, no. I mean, the short answer is no. As with every other year we've collected data for HRMI, the United States remains the worst performing high-income democracy on both safety from the state and empowerment rights. And it's the worst performing high-income democracy on most of the individual rights we measure. Not all, but most. There is some evidence that the United States may have slightly improved performance on the rights to assembly and association and on freedom from arbitrary or political arrest. But I believe, placing those in context, those changes can probably largely be attributed to the removal of COVID restrictions and a reduction in the intensity of protests compared to what we observed in 2020. The United States remains a country in which human rights violations disproportionately target and affect some people far more than others. And under the Biden administration, we just haven't seen the reforms needed to end this kind of pervasive discrimination and abuse. Those reforms just haven't happened. So, as of now, the U.S.'s scores remain abysmally low for a high-income democracy.
Thanks for that, Chad.